This should be interesting.
Trump have very different tax plans they'd like to implement if elected for another term. Very different.
There's a $6 trillion difference, at least, between the two sides if each were to get its own ideal policies in place.
Okay, but is there a $6 trillion spending difference as well? Because one very accurate criticism that's been lobbied at Republicans by leftists, by Democrats, is that they want to cut taxes without cutting spending and just running up massive deficits. I'm very much anti-tax, but I don't think that it's any better to cut taxes and just have the Federal Reserve create that money out of thin air. What you really have to look at is total government spending, and frankly, in nominal terms, since I don't think the government should get the credit for the inflation it's creating in the first place. So so really, I guess the question is, what are their spending plans, or what are their proposals to rein in spending?
With broad tax cuts from 2017 set to expire at the
Which, I mean, the answer is they don't have any, because for politicians, spending is power. So on the left or the right, they both want to spend as much taxpayer money as they can, as we saw during Trump's last term and Biden's present term.
end of next year, Biden and Trump are headed in opposite directions.
A fair tax code is how we invest things to make this country great.
We will cut your taxes even further. That's what built our economy.
Here's what's in that $6 trillion chasm and the difficulties with turning those plans into law.
This is the bill right here, and we're very proud of it.
In December 2017, Trump signed into law the most far-reaching overhaul of the U.S. tax system in decades. The legislation included lower individual tax rates ending before January 1st, 2026, with a maximum rate of 37%, down from the previous 39.6%. Standard deduction increased. Child tax credit doubled. And the corporate tax.
So overall, that looks pretty good. The child tax credit, it's a little iffy because it's not necessarily a tax credit. I might be wrong here. I know in Canada it's basically just a subsidy. And just from a little brief research online, it looks like the U.S. thing is the same. That being said, a little extra cash to low-income parents, it's not the end of the world. I mean, especially in the grand scope of a $6 trillion budget
Tax rate
or
was
whatever.
permanently slashed to 21%.
But cutting the marginal rate, sure, absolutely. Cutting tax rates throughout. And people say you shouldn't cut tax cuts. You shouldn't have tax cuts for the rich, which in relation to this, they're really talking about high income individuals who are not necessarily rich, but often are, or at least there's some correlation there. I mean, you can be high income and not rich, but the problem is that high income individuals are paying the vast majority of the taxes. So if you want to do any real tax cutting, you're gonna have something for higher income individuals.
Its lowest point since 19.
But so yeah, I mean, the from what I'm hearing here, the Trump tax cuts sound good. However, I'd like to see equivalent spending cuts, whether that's rolling back entitlements, or reduction in military spending. There's a lot of ways you could go about doing it. Probably you'd have to tackle the entitlements, since that's the bulk of federal spending. Although that's a little tricky politically because old people will have to vote.
1939.
The goal was to try to spur investment, to give businesses more deductions, lower rates, lower taxes on their profits so they'd be more incentivized to make profits, to give people more money in their pockets so they would spend more money.
But the sweeping cuts also drew criticism.
The president is part of the top 1%, and the bill is aimed to help the top 1%.
If Congress does nothing, those individual tax cuts will expire at the end of 2025. and the government estimates that the national revenue would follow this line. Neither Biden nor Trump wants that to happen. Trump's plan would bring in less money than the revenue baseline. Biden's plan would collect more. The two agree on extending tax cuts for households that make under $400,000 a year. But there is a major difference in how they would tax big corporations and people at the highest income levels.
I will make the Trump tax cuts permanent. You know, they expire in a year. And we will cut your taxes even more than that.
Trump's approach to taxes is to try to lower them. Trump and Republicans really believe that low tax rates are incredibly important for the economy.
Extending those tax cuts would cost the government up to $4 trillion over the next decade.
It's not clear here which is better. I mean, if the Trump cuts were combined with spending cuts and there was no deficit, then that would be better. But given that the tax cuts are funded by deficit spending, I mean, I don't want to advocate in favor of taxes, but I don't want to advocate in favor of inflationary deficits either. Now, there is the starve the beast philosophy, the idea that, I mean, if you go the Joe Biden route and you raise taxes on people making more than $400,000 in corporations, then yes, you might get more revenue, but that'll just encourage politicians to pass more spending bills, and you're going to end up with more debt and higher taxes versus the Trump plan, where you would have more debt and lower taxes. I mean, ideally, we would see lower taxes and the deficit eliminated through spending cuts, radical spending cuts. I mean, I'm talking about, eliminating some departments, whole cloth, massive reductions in the amount of bureaucrats employed at the federal level, possibly the sale of federal land or federal buildings, shut down some buildings. I mean, I'm not even American, so I guess, but that's what that would be my plan were I president.
For example, keeping the reduced rates and wider tax brackets for ordinary income would cost some $2 trillion, and the expanded standard deduction would reduce federal revenue by over $900 billion.
At least they both agree on the reduced taxes for people making less than $400,000. That's a no-brainer.
There's been some back and forth among Republicans about exactly how comfortable they are with further increases in the deficit because of tax cuts. In the 2017 law, not everyone got a tax cut. There were things that raised money to help offset the changes they made. But in general, they weren't trying to keep things deficit neutral. They were willing to increase deficits in order to cut taxes. And that's a choice they'll have to make again.
On the other side of the divide, Biden wants not only to pay for the rate cuts he'd like to keep, but also bring in additional revenue. Getting that done would not be easy.
He wants to extend the tax cuts for people making under $400,000. So it's a couple $1 trillion, not the full $4 trillion, but a good chunk of that to keep those tax cuts going for most people.
Beyond that, Biden says he'll increase taxes in other areas to bring in more money for the government.
If you want to make or can make $1 million or millions of bucks, that's great. Just pay your fair share in taxes.
Fairness is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to taxes. His idea is basically that high-income people and corporations should pay more, and that money should go largely for new programs and for reducing deficit.
Biden hasn't laid out exactly where all of this money would come from, but he has outlined what would be some key revenue sources, including raising the corporate tax from 21% to 28%. The Treasury estimates that alone would garner some $1.3 trillion for the government over 10 years. He has also proposed taxes on individuals at the top, like an increased Medicare tax, revamping capital income taxes, and imposing a 25% minimum tax on the super rich. That set of changes would raise...
What is this 25% tax on the super rich? All right, I guess the 25% tax for billionaires would just mean that if you have like $1 billion, then any income you get is taxed at a 25% tax rate, which I think it would be mostly ceremonial. I don't think that would bring in very much money. But whatever, it's not really a big deal either way.
Raise more than $1.8 trillion. Overall, Biden wants to cover the $4 trillion for continued tax cuts and raise taxes by more than $2 trillion on top of that. But there's a catch.
A lot of
I think raising the corporate income tax would be riskier or more likely to backfire. I mean, we have a global economy, and already a lot of companies are parking their corporations in Ireland or other tax havens like Panama. There's a lot of islands in the Caribbean and like the British Isles where they serve as havens for corporations to set up and send their revenue there and not pay tax on it. So raising the corporate tax might just encourage those tax dollars to flow elsewhere. The corporate tax is also an unfair form of double taxation because that money is going to go out of the corporation eventually, paid in salary or dividends or whatnot, and it'll be taxed at that point. Like I said, I definitely think a tax on income, aka your labor, is a lot more offensive than some of these other taxes.
the tax increases that Biden is running on are ones that he ran on in 2020 or has proposed during his first term. Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House for 2021 and 2022, and very few of the tax increases they wanted got through. As we think about the $6 trillion or more gap between the two candidates, so much really depends on the results of the election.
Democrats and Republicans both want to extend tax cuts for the majority of Americans, but even getting that done will be messy.
There's likely to be one big tax bill in 2025. And so even if there's a point of agreement on what happens for the bulk of people, the revenue consequences, the distribution
Yeah, this is really a solid video. Props to WSJ.
consequences, the political consequences are all tied to what happens to corporations and high-income people. People making under $400,000 should feel somewhat confident that their tax cuts will get extended because both parties want to do it, but it will be just inextricably linked to what happens broadly with all the pieces of the tax cuts that are contentious.
So there you have it. You got the Biden tax plan and the Trump tax plan. And I gotta say, I don't necessarily see which one is obviously better. I am very anti-tax, but what really matters is aggregate government spending. Neither plan seems to be dealing with that at all, nor, for that matter, is either candidate very concerned about the size of government spending, which I guess is pretty much par for the course.